Have you ever had a moment in your life where you wondered what God was doing? Maybe you felt like God was silent or God was absent in some crisis in your life, or maybe you just kind of felt like, God, why are you allowing these bad things to happen to good people? Well, if you've ever had those questions, and I'm sure we all have, then I think you're going to appreciate the book of Esther. Because Esther is an interesting example of how God works in everyday life. You see, Esther is one of the most intriguing and controversial books of the Bible, and that's because the book of Esther never mentions God. Nowhere. I mean, think about that. It's a book of the Bible that never mentions God. And it does this because the book of Esther is trying to show us how God works in everyday life without miracles, without visions, without dreams, how God works. And so we're going to see what God was doing in the life of Esther, in the story of Esther. And through that, we're going to see what God's doing in our lives. So let's go ahead and, first of all, look at some background for the book of Esther. The book of Esther takes place in the Old Testament. Now, in this point in the history of the Old Testament, God's people, the Israelites, have now come to be known as the Jews. And that's because the Israelites had a civil war where they broke into two different nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And Israel was attacked by the Assyrians. They were taken off into captivity, and they were never heard from again. In Judah, in the southern kingdom, they were also besieged by a different group called the Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, and they too were taken from their land, and they were taken to Babylonia. But God had promised that although they would go into exile because of the fact that they had violated God's law, they'd sinned against him, that eventually God's people, the Jews, would be allowed to return to Jerusalem. And that's exactly what happened. After 70 years, people like Ezra and Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, rebuilt the city, and rebuilt the temple. But not every Jewish person returned to Jerusalem. Some stayed. See, what had happened was a new kingdom after the Babylonians, the Persians, had risen up, and they had taken control of the Babylonian Empire. And the Persian king was actually the one who said, okay, Jews, you can go back home. But not all the Jews did, like we said. And some of them stayed in Persia, and they stayed around the Persian court. And that's what's going on in the book of Esther. It's the story of Jews who stayed in Persia and didn't return home. So that sets the stage for this interesting story. So let's look at chapter 1 of the book of Esther. God's people were controlled by a dictator. In the story of Esther, the Persian king is a guy named Xerxes. And when the book starts out, Xerxes decides to throw this huge party. It's a 6-month party for all the richest people, all the nobles, the military leaders. And Xerxes can do this because he's incredibly wealthy. And so they have this just raging party with a lot of alcohol and I'm sure a lot of other stuff going on. And this is this party that just goes on. And it's just an incredible demonstration of Xerxes' wealth. Well, he decides that the last 7 days of the party, he wants to open up to everyone else. And so he invites everybody in the capital of Susa to come to this party. And he says, you get as drunk as you want and do whatever you want, and we're just going to go crazy and party for 7 days. Well, the Bible says that at the end of the 7 days of hard drinking, so when Xerxes is just wasted, he gets this idea. He summons his queen, Queen Vashti, and he says, I want you to come and I want to show you off to all my friends. I mean, this tells you what kind of guy this really is. That's what he says. He says, I want you to put on your prettiest outfit, and I want you to come in front of my friends, and I want them to all see how beautiful you are, and I want them to lust after you and wish that you were their wife instead of my wife. And so you can see this guy's a jerk. This guy's a dictator. And so he does that. He tells Vashti that she needs to come and show herself off to all of his friends. Well, she refuses. She says, I'm not going to do that. And this makes the king angry, and this makes all of his friends angry. And they say, King, what are you going to do? Because if all the women of Persia find out that the queen isn't going to listen to the king, then what hope do we have that our wives are going to listen to us? And so they come up with a plan. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. So basically they say, look, we can't have Vashti be queen anymore. And so the king says, okay, that'll be the rule. He removes the crown from Vashti and he says she's no longer queen. And the idea is that this will put every woman in Persia in their proper place. Now you might think this is a bizarre story. I mean, this alcoholic, probably sex-addicted king, Xerxes, is doing all these weird things. Why is this in the Bible? What's God doing here? Well, what we see is God is beginning to put together the pieces of the puzzle that are going to make up the book of Esther. Let's see what happens in chapter 2. Esther becomes queen of Persia. Well, 3 years go by between chapters 1 and 2, and Xerxes decides it's time for me to choose a new queen. And so what he does, this terrible guy, what he does is he gathers together the most beautiful virgins from all of Persia. And his plan is he's going to spend one night with each virgin, and if he likes one of them, he'll make them the queen of Persia. And so as he's gathering these beautiful virgins, we are introduced to two people, Mordecai and Esther. Now, they're Jewish. And Mordecai, as Mordecai, it says, has raised Esther, even though she's his cousin, he's raised her because she's an orphan. And she goes off to spend this time getting ready to go before the king. And Mordecai sends her on her way, and he says, don't tell anyone that you're a Jew. And so all the preparation time goes by, and eventually it's Esther's turn to go before the king, and we find out what happens. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. So Xerxes falls for her, and he says, you will be my queen, and she becomes queen, but remember, she still has not told him that she is a Jew. Now, as chapter 2 closes, there's one other important event. Mordecai saves the king. You see, we read that Mordecai found out that there was a plot between two of the king's guards to assassinate him. And so what Mordecai does is he tells Esther about this plot, and she relays this message to the king, and the king is saved. And now file this little story away because it's going to come into play later on in this story. So as we think about this quick summary of Esther 1 and 2, what's going on in this story? What's going on is God uses unusual events to accomplish his plans. I've already compared Esther, the story of Esther, to like a puzzle, but I can also think of it as a chessboard. That God is putting together the pieces of the chessboard to accomplish his plans. You know, he has made it so that Xerxes, this alcoholic, sex-addicted guy, would be in charge. And he's made it so that Esther would come before the king and become queen, and that Vashti would be removed as queen. And he's set it up so that Mordecai would save the king's life. And God is doing all of this stuff to fulfill his future plans. You know, God does the same thing in our lives. He doesn't always work, and often he doesn't work through the miraculous or even the mysterious, but he works through everyday occurrences for our own good. Take a look at what Romans 8:28 says about this. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. This verse says that in the life of every Christian, God is taking everything that happens to you, the good, the bad, the bizarre, all of it, and he is using it for your good. He's putting it together in such a way as to bless you, to help you, and to take care of you in the future. And that's what we see in the story of Esther. What is God doing? God is fulfilling his plan through unusual circumstances.